Welcome back to another edition of Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn. Well, if there's anything the year of 2020 has shown us, it's that institutional structures and government policy really do guide what the outcomes are in our society. In this show, we're going to take a look at racial disparities in housing and community development associated with years of rules and regulations that in many cases have made things worse, not better. My special guest is Lisa Rice, CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance, based in Washington, D.C., a group that works to preserve and broaden fair housing protections, expanding equal housing opportunities. Lisa, thank you for coming on the show for Land Matters.
Anthony, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on your show.
Well, I think you might agree this year has exposed and revealed so much, especially vivid in the area of housing and all the work that you've been immersed in. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about how housing and land and race have become part of the current presidential campaign, but I thought it was important to start with a little history and context. As is often the case, it seems to me, with these discussions, it's hard to know where to start. But I think our listeners would benefit from a little history going back to the end of the Civil War and the short-lived success of land grants and land redistribution. I suppose there's no point in bemoaning what might have been, but can you tell us a little bit about how that moment, kind of a short-lived experiment in the form of reparations, collapsed and set a course for the next 150 years?
If you'll allow me, I actually would like to start before the Civil War. I've been having this conversation with many stakeholders, corporations, so the financial services institutions, insurance companies, housing industry groups. And what I find really fascinating is how little we all really know about the history of race and racism in the United States of America. So that's why I want to kind of actually go back before the Civil War. I want to center this discussion in a very personal way. My African ancestors were brought to this land for one purpose and one reason only, and that is to be an economic base for white people. Black people's raison d'etre, if you will, is to provide wealth and to build wealth for other people and not for themselves. That's why we were brought here. And even when people of color were able to obtain their freedom, this is pre-Civil War, and during the period of slavery, the institutionalization of slavery in America, even when people of color were able to obtain their freedom and build wealth for themselves and for their families, it was taken away by violence, by court order, by legislation. Anthony Johnson is a great example of this, right? Anthony Johnson was taken from Angola, Africa, and ultimately in 1619 arrived with about 20 or so other Black people in Jamestown, a British settlement. It marked the beginning of slavery in the British colonies. Now, slavery had already existed in other areas in what is now called the United States of America, long before 1619. The 1619 just marked the beginning of slavery in the British colonies. Anthony Johnson ultimately won his freedom. He worked 15 years and got his freedom and purchased land in Maryland, which he turned into a tobacco farm, a thriving enterprise, actually. And upon his death, the colony that he lived in Maryland took the family's land from Mr. Johnson's heirs and gave the plantation to a white planter, his neighbor, because the court determined that Mr. Johnson was not a citizen solely because he was a Black man. And our history is filled with stories like this through violence, through policies, through our culture, legislation. We've underscored this idea, this notion that people of color weren't meant to be actual owners or to obtain wealth in their own right. Their ingenuity, their labor, their wealth were just meant to be resources for the benefit of other people, not themselves. Laws passed during the colonial period underscored this. The slave codes, the Black codes all reinforced this. Many of these laws actually took land and homes and businesses and property away from Black and brown folks stripping them of their wealth and then transferring that wealth to white citizens who were living in the cities where these folks were living. The US Constitution, of course, reinforced this notion as well. Our early laws, like the Indian Removal Act, supported this concept as well. The taking away of assets from people of color and literally just transferring those assets to whites. So then we get to this moment of the Civil War. And after the ending of the Civil War, there's a short-lived experiment with reparations. And I really have to put quotations around that because it wasn't fully implemented. So the so-called Reconstruction era, for example, you had some Union generals who pushed this idea that every former slave should receive 40 acres and a mule, but that was never really fully implemented. It wasn't implemented across the board. And in the cases where it was implemented, the land that Black people cultivated and grew into really thriving enterprises was taken away from them and given back to the former slave owners. So in truth, after slavery, our laws and policies actually reinforced this idea, this notion again, that wealth attainment was only for whites. And we have laws that blatantly say this on their face: Chinese Exclusion Act, repatriation programs, the grandfather clauses that prevented people of color from being able to vote. Another example of this, and I think we might get into this in more detail, is the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act and the National Housing Act. So we passed law after law after law. We engaged in violent practices. The Tulsa Massacre is an example of this. The Wilmington Massacre, another example. The Rosewood Massacre, another example of where Black people built thriving businesses, built thriving business districts and enterprises, only to have them violently demolished, all of their wealth stripped away. Again, sort of bringing back home this idea, this concept that you're not here to build wealth and to maintain wealth and sustain wealth in your own right. You're here merely to be a resource for someone else. So it's like you're not here to partake in and realize the promise of America. And all these laws and policies, really what they did was just bake racism and inequality into the fabric of our society. And unfortunately, we've never done anything to rectify this structural unfairness.
Well, there's always a danger of moving too fast, but let me fast forward to the Great Depression and some of those New Deal policies that were meant to expand home ownership and some of the problems baked into those policies and guidelines, which led to redlining and embracing racial covenants and other evidence of this structural racism. That was a key moment. And then I want to move ahead to another key inflection point, and that is the Fair Housing Act, and then talk about what's going on with the Fair Housing Act today. But in the Great Depression, another opportunity, similar to the end of the Civil War in some ways, to put in place policies that would encourage home ownership for everyone, but that didn't quite happen.
Unfortunately, it did not. During the Great Depression, the government implemented a number of programs in order to help support families and communities. We were in the throes of really a massive foreclosure crisis. The foreclosure rate was about 25%. And so what the government wanted to do was establish a program to essentially allow people to refinance out of what were unsustainable mortgages. So at that time, Anthony, we didn't have the typical sort of garden variety mortgage product that we have today, the fully amortizing fixed rate 30-year mortgage. That wasn't a construct at the time. Mortgage loans at the time were balloon notes. And so after 5 years, you'd have to pay this huge balloon. And of course, no one could afford to do that. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was developed in order to refinance people out of these unsustainable mortgages and put them into sustainable loans. The Homeowners Loan Corporation created the amortized mortgage. It was a 15-year note at that time, I believe. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation wanted to determine where it should be investing these dollars, where it should be backing these refinances, and when they gave someone a refinance loan, how much they should be charging for it. So they developed this system to grade neighborhoods or place a value on different areas. They created something called the Residential Security Survey, and from that were generated residential security maps. Today, we call these redlining maps. They're basically trying to identify what areas are safe for government-backed lending. And so the surveys and maps are grouped into neighborhoods in one of four categories. You get your grade A neighborhoods, which are color-coded green. That means these are the best neighborhoods. Grade B neighborhoods, which were color-coded blue, are neighborhoods that are still desirable. Grade C, which were color-coded yellow, are areas that were designated to be definitely declining. So these are cautionary neighborhoods. And then grade D, red, which is the neighborhoods that were deemed to be hazardous. Red, hence the term redlining. These are the areas that you really don't want to lend. And if you do lend in these areas, you have to charge an exorbitant fee because these are hazardous areas. Now, the presence of African Americans in a neighborhood or a community, no matter how small, it could be 2% of the community being comprised of African Americans, it could be 5%. No matter how small, the presence of Black people generally necessitated a red or a hazardous grade. Now, Anthony, I have not read every single residential security survey. I've read and reviewed many, though, thousands, and I have yet to come across any area that had any African American residents that was not color coded as red or hazardous. The survey form actually had a special place on the survey form to indicate the percentage of the quote unquote Negro population. So they wanted to know how many Black folks are living here. There's no other racial group that is given this specific designation except for Black people. Now, I will hasten to say that the Homeowners Loan Corporation did not create redlining, but it institutionalized it by preventing this system and this structure and these series of maps for over 200 cities across the country. These maps were widely used by real estate professionals. They were widely used by lenders. In fact, the HOLC actually hired real estate professionals to create these surveys. So it's a very incestuous relationship between the HOLC and lenders and real estate agents. And so ultimately what happened is municipalities funneled taxpayer dollars into the green and blue areas and did not funnel taxpayer dollars for infrastructure and business development and things of that nature, did not invest dollars in the red line areas, the red and the yellow areas, because those were the areas that were deemed to be declining or hazardous. What happened was African Americans and Latinos, as they were moving into many of these cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Indianapolis, they were racially steered into those red and yellow areas. In fact, that's what happened to my family. When my mom and dad wanted to purchase their home, they wanted to initially purchase a home in a predominantly white suburban community right outside of Toledo, Ohio, called Sylvania. The real estate agent explained to my parents that they could not purchase a home in Sylvania. In fact, the real estate agent told my mom, Mrs. Rice, if I even show you a property in Sylvania, not only will I lose my job, but I will lose my real estate license. And she took my parents to a neighborhood in Toledo that was a quote unquote changing neighborhood called Parkside Extensions. When we moved there, we were the only Black family in the neighborhood. By the time I started kindergarten, 99% of my neighborhood was African American. So Blacks were racially steered into these areas that were deemed to be declining or hazardous areas. And it set up and really built up the system of residential segregation. In fact, Anthony, we're more segregated today than we were 100 years ago. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, worked in tandem with the HOLC. They used these maps in the FHA program. The FHA demanded residential segregation in the implementation of its programs. It demanded and encouraged the use of racially restrictive covenants by giving preferential treatment and funding to communities that adopted them. They required builders and development to implement racially restrictive covenants in order to receive funding in the terms of lending insurance. So the federal government really engineered segregation in America. And because of that, unfortunately, where we live actually dictates so much about us because in the United States, place is so inextricably linked to opportunity. And these are issues that we're still trying to grapple with today, Anthony.
Well, that brings us to the Fair Housing Act, and I'm hoping you can tell us in our remaining time a little bit about the rationale for the Fair Housing Act and how it was envisioned to begin to dismantle or unravel some of this structured segregation and the patterns that we saw especially in suburban development. So the Fair Housing Act comes along and it's an attempt to address some of what you just described.
Yes, it absolutely is, Anthony. The Federal Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968, is not our nation's first fair housing law. The first fair housing law was actually passed during the Reconstruction era in 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It prohibited discrimination. But as I've just explained, the federal government actually engaged in perpetuating discrimination, demanding residential segregation, not only in the housing units, multifamily housing units that the federal government was building and supporting, but also in the lending programs that the federal government was underwriting. And so civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. recognized that if it was the government that perpetuated discrimination and segregation and redlining, it was going to have to be the federal government that would have to undo the harm and the structures that they created and caused. And so the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed and included a bevy of provisions, including the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision, which says that any entity, could be a federal agency, it could be a state agency, it could be a municipality, it could be a public housing authority, it could be a local nonprofit organization. Any entity that receives any federal funding for housing or community development must not engage in any form of segregation or discrimination. And they also have to implement all of their programs in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. The goal of this is to not only help hasten the elimination of housing discrimination and lending discrimination, but to help undo and dismantle systemic residential segregation and all of the negative impacts that come along with that. The Fair Housing Act was passed 7 days after the assassination of Dr. King. And I have to make that point because the law was not going to pass. The Fair Housing Act, we think of this civil rights triumvirate. You get the Voting Rights Act, you get the Civil Rights Act of 1965, right? You get the Public Accommodations Law and the Employment Law. But the Fair Housing Act had been introduced in Congress. It was languishing in Congress. It was going nowhere. And then after Dr. King was assassinated, President Johnson wanted to show the American people that he was serious about civil rights protections and really pushed for the passage of the law. So it is designed to deconstruct the horrendous work, the horrendous discrimination and discriminatory infrastructure that the federal government helped to put in place.
Well, it's amazing to think, but here we are, more than 50 years later. Housing and the Fair Housing Act has become part of the current presidential campaign. And I am quoting from the Wall Street Journal op-ed by President Trump and HUD Secretary Ben Carson, who have indicated that they want to stop areas being subject to the relentless push for more high-density housing in single-family residential neighborhoods. So what do they mean by that?
I have no idea. It's dog whistles It's actually a very confusing message because Secretary Carson, in the AFFH proposal, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing proposal that the Trump administration put forward, they actually said they wanted to reward jurisdictions for increasing affordable housing, which means more higher density housing. So I don't know why they are saying the antithesis of that in this op-ed. I have no idea what they actually meant to say, but I do think that it was just a dog whistle.
Well, what can local communities do? What can the nation do now, from your perspective, to expand housing opportunities? Again, look at the rules and regulations, many of them at the local level, things like zoning and this idea of more multifamily housing to expand supply. In our remaining time, what are some of the key things that you think we should work on housing now?
I think communities have got to look at housing opportunities through a lens of racial equity. Have to do that. The Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation implemented the largest affordable housing programs that I think arguably have existed in the history of the United States. And they were done in a very racialized way. They were done in a way that increased discrimination and segregation. So just the building and development of affordable housing alone is not going to address fair housing issues. Affordable housing is not in and of itself fair housing. It is a part and parcel of it. So you've got to take a look at what are the barriers that are precluding people from being able to access fair housing opportunities. Look at that very honestly, and then implement solutions that are going to rectify the issue and expand equal and fair housing opportunities, and also work to ensure that neighborhoods and communities that don't have the opportunities and amenities that they need, doctors' offices, hospitals, healthy food options, clean and healthy and safe environments, high performing schools, and so forth, and so clean water, high quality infrastructure. I think that local municipalities and jurisdictions need to be about the businesses of making sure that those communities do have those amenities and services so that everyone has an opportunity to live a healthy and successful life.
Well, this is an extraordinary year, and it's led to a lot of introspection, and I think a healthy exercise in looking at this history and how we've reached this point in our history. So, Lisa Rice, thank you for joining us to talk this through.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, all our listeners, for tuning into Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We try to look behind the scenes to understand what makes our cities and all our communities tick, and we're finding answers in land. Until next time, I'm your host, Anthony Flynn.